The concept of the afterlife, and of limbo specifically, is one that's interested me ever since I learnt of it many years ago, and one that had fascinated the world for centuries before I even existed to be interested in it. While most versions of the afterlife tend to either reward you for doing good deeds in life, or punish you for all those times you didn't recycle, the idea of something in between, some place that can exist in a more complicated position, and that can act as a go-between for those whose deeds haven't yet been weighed up, is arguably often more interesting than the concepts of heaven or hell, and have layers that work very well when explored in stories, especially those that delve into the more abstract side of this idea. Given Solvoid has a disembodied evil smile for a villain, a protagonist who may or may not be dead for most of its story, and at least one haunted cookie demon alongside a metric ton of weird and wonderful designs for various otherworldly entities, I think it might be one of the best examples of the story and game potential of Limbo out there. Other than maybe Limbo itself, if only because of the name. Solvoid does a solid job of giving you just enough story to interest you at the start of things, and then steadily revealing more and more about its surreal world of talking teeth trees and harrowing cookie policing ghouls, until you're equal parts fascinated, delighted, and just a little bit unsettled, in a sort of satisfying, this will haunt me but the nightmares will be worth it kind of way. We start out in a scene that looks remarkably similar to the Undertale opening to my possibly cooked brain, wherein the kind, if somewhat snarky, Grim Reaper entity known as the Greeter welcomes you to the Void, a sort of limbo-esque location between life and death. However, things kick off with something of a hitch, as the Greeter also informs you that you're actually not supposed to be here, and if the spooky supernatural being can't work out exactly why or how we ended up in this other world, rather than being safe and sound in the land of the living, it's not looking exactly great for us either. The opening works effectively to set up the tone of Solvoid, which I think nails that perfect, comedic but still capable of being serious vibe that takes the likes of indie RPG giants like Off and Undertale from being a fun romp around a cool pixel world to something that can make you laugh, and maybe shed a little tear about an angry skeleton at the same time. It's almost basic game maths. You take a surreal scenario, add a bunch of characters who are super chill to an almost worrying degree about said bizarro setting, and often magic is made. As such, you're introduced to the concept of the Beyond Lands, also known as the Solvoid for that extra little title card flair, told you shouldn't be here and it's probably a very, very bad and worrying thing that you're here at all, and then sent off into it with a shrug. Sort of how I imagine my birth might have been, in short. Now, for this next bit, I'm going to condense down my exact experience of my first 5 minutes in this game, just to convey how quickly things go from 0 to 100 here. So, I walked around a bit, had a chat with some characters, brought this little pal their partner's ring, and then walked onto one screen, saw the stuff of my actual goddamn nightmares, in the form of a huge, terrifying, Lovecraftian disembodied face, noped immediately out of there due to sheer instinct and genuine fear, and suddenly became totally convinced of two things. Firstly, that this game was going to be way more stressful than I first imagined, and secondly, that I needed to make a video on it. As it turns out, yeeting my character's body out of the screen because I'm an actual real-life coward did sabotage things a bit, because you can't go back there afterwards. This proved just interesting enough to convince me to get my act together and restart to know what on earth I'd just witnessed, which paid off in the form of some mild trauma, as our new buddy the homicidal soulless grin also welcomes us to the Void, and hits us with a promise of fun that seems about as promising as Slenderman offering you an ice cream. With that said, we do recruit a chicken, talk to a nice, giant diver entity, and find a nice little village. So things aren't all that bad, I guess. The village provides us our next main character in the form of the mayor, who introduces a fun part of the visuals of Solvoid, namely some funky full-body portraits, which are helpful in nailing exactly what kind of wonderful weirdo we're actually talking to. Case in point, whatever is going on with the mayor, this essentially serves as the end of the tutorial of sorts, with our eyeless overseer sending us on our way into the wilder parts of the Void, after explaining the answers to our questions are seemingly out in the Beyond Lands, meaning we need to go into a more dangerous place than ever before. We also get to reunite with the chicken we picked up along the way, which I mention not because it has any plot significance, but rather because it mattered to me, damn it, and because no matter how bad the horrors we went through after this were, I could at least rest in the knowledge, most of the time, that our poultry pal was at least safe at home. It's at this point I should go into the main gameplay of Solvoid, because while the story and balance of horror and jokes is what really got me, exactly how you play a video game is sort of important to it being a game, and not just a PowerPoint presentation that you emotionally attach to. What I did find interesting about Solvoid is that it's closer in some ways to what I would probably call pure horror RPG games, like Mad Father and Ib. So nothing in the way of RPG fights. I'm rather focusing on more self-contained areas with puzzles to solve, which involves more active things, like dodging enemies and working out their patterns to ensure you don't get sent back to the beginning of an area thanks to their fleshy embrace, to the classic collect X items and return to continue on. As such, after immediately finding ourselves in another encounter with the Smile, whose actual name is the Grim, that is still pretty uncomfortable, but not quite as sweat-worthy as the first one, we're plopped down next to some grassy hands and brought into the aptly named Grasping Forest. The horror of the game begins to be communicated here by a look at what happens to the denizens of the Grasping Forest, via a series of NPCs who are slowly turning into one of the stone statues that litter the area, known as the Thorned. Nightmarishly, we learn these folks are still seemingly sentient even after facing this fate on some level, via literally the second Thorned we meet in this area, who is depicted as breathing, but unable to move or speak, which is a fate straight out of a focus group of all of our very worst nightmares, and just upsetting enough to me as a concept that I can feel my brain repressing the implications of it, even now as I speak. During this first foray, you get to talk to one of the scouts tasked with trying to do something to help the Thorned, and enter the cursed hell that is this room, where you pick up one of the first major items of the game, a familiar heart. This won't be useful to note until far later, but is worth keeping in mind from now, if only so you can ask yourself the same questions I had about why this heart is familiar, and what purpose a familiar heart could serve as we go forward. After getting a pep talk from a giant curled-up creature with a vine for a face, we get returns from two characters who manage to crop up way more than you might expect for a game that keeps its runtime to a healthy few hours. The Diver is the first of these, and offers insight on the nature of the Void, namely that it isn't specifically a horrorscape to make all your nightmares into game reality, but rather a world that pulls from the heart, the mind, and the soul, and the complicated mix of ideas and feelings that reside therein. Naturally, this makes a lot of what it draws from actual legitimate nightmare fuel. But, as the Diver says, because it can feel like bad things stay longer in our minds sometimes, the Void can look as though it draws more deeply from them. I like to think this is why so much of the game is surprisingly cheerful and whimsical in nature, as a sort of in-universe explanation of the setting via a cosmic vibe check. Then we meet the Grim, again. Okay, so first we meet the Seeker, who's sort of a mix between a hard-boiled noir detective and Slenderman. If Slenderman was a pretty nice guy, since the Seeker offers to work with us about getting to the bottom of what's going on with the Solvoid, even revealing they already have a theory about what draws lost souls to this strange world. However, in true video game story fashion, the Seeker's dramatic confession that they know what happened to bring you here and are so sorry is cut short from actually helping you via the Grim, who yeets you both out and, kindly in doing so, unlocks the second area of the game. I mean, I say kindly, but that sort of disguises the fact that said area is a nightmare tooth forest filled with unsettling enamel-hungry creatures. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the task of this area is to collect enough teeth to satisfy the eye, tooth, vine, whatever this thing is, in order to get through. While it's the area you spend the least time in, I do want to shout out the mouth maze, as I think visually it's really distinct and striking, and really uses the pixel art style of the game in a way that just hits right, and elevates the experience from conga line through the most trippy areas to exist outside of Mother 3, to a game where you also do things and have to activate your lovely frontal lobe to get things done. That said, I should qualify this with the fact that while it's a pretty surreal task to go around pulling up teeth from what I can only hope we can call the ground, it's not all that hard to get these teeth. And indeed, one little guy offers you teeth even though you can't bring it the bees it craves as payment. So I didn't have any issues with bringing enough to the tooth stalk, even if I missed out on doing so the first time because my hand-eye coordination is that of an ill Victorian child being introduced to a computer for the first time. This is one of the neat features of Solvoid, as based on the notes the creator put in the walkthrough for the game, the challenges like this in the game all come with an NPC who can bypass them for you. Either if you want to pass through a certain section more easily, or in the case of the puzzles themselves bugging out somehow. While them being before the actual areas can make it possible to accidentally do so without realizing what you're doing if you're not the sharpest tool in the shed, as I did here on my first playthrough, since it made looking through the game more than once feel way more exciting, and like a reward rather than a chore. Our pal Toothstalk takes us into a cutscene that teases once more how there is significantly more to our protagonist and them getting trapped in this world. And past that to a classic but brief blood swamp that will be familiar to anyone who has played low-key any video game ever, filled with some suitable ooze-looking enemies that you need to dodge while wading through the area. It's also complete with its own major NPC, the Waiting, who, as the name well suggests, wants out of the blood cave. When you pick up a knife from a troubling, person-shaped indent in a flesh wall, it certainly seems like this is about to go down one specific, awful way. As it turns out, though, your general stabbery is instead directed to some massive ventricle pipe, and then a lovely fleshy wall that reveals the blood cave is connected to an area that looks like a series of children's drawings. Because, of course it is. And because, of course, the semi-haunting husk and his land of self-doubt needed to be just that bit creepier via the additional spooky connection of hack and slashing your way through a meat wall to get there. The sketchyard, despite looking like that one horror episode of Doctor Who that haunted my childhood and made an admittedly banging Flash game back in the day, actually weirdly ends up being one of the more heartwarming locations in the entire game. At risk of being painfully honest here, this area hit me way more than I expected to. And not just because of the little mouse who still hopes for the best at this nightmare hellscape. Though the husk appears like some sort of pixel art found footage spectre, it's revealed over the course of the level that the husk is an artist. And an artist who's experiencing some pretty miserable feelings that I reckon anyone who has made anything ever can probably relate to. And hell, probably can relate to even if they haven't. The husk is plagued with self-doubt, convinced his art is secretly bad and nobody has told him as part of some cosmic prank, and is too afraid of being perceived by others to consider anyone but his own creations as friends. So if you put the husk in a ginger wig, it and Teen Me are essentially the same person. However, after looking at his memories and fears, we're able to help the husk find peace with these ideas, complete with a little monologue about art being special, not because of the amount of it or skill utilised, but rather because anything made by someone has worth in being a reflection of that person, and their hopes, dreams, and lives. This is particularly endearing in that it's one of the few times our character actively gets to speak, and is probably the moment I decided I would try and get the best possible ending for our pixel protagonist, or frankly die trying. Right after this, we get one of the most harrowing area transitions in the game, wherein we're confronted with a bunch of faceless versions of us, who bring in some unholy sort of Macarena while communicating pretty effectively in pretty few words that our character has some major self-esteem issues, to say the least. Unless we're to take the unsettling monologue about ripping our face off, and the choice to depict us in the scene without our head is simply showing the protagonist has a somehow solely aesthetic love of beheadings, which would almost be more worrying. The uptick in my blood pressure doesn't stop there, though, as the next area introduces us to the world's most stressed clock, a building full of overworked employees with burnout and imposter syndrome, and some slide puzzles that, to be fair, were way less intense than I was emotionally preparing for them to be. Much to the operator's presumed horror, our objective here is to smash up the systems that keep up the hectic pace of this area, which is creating seemingly pointless stuff, and give everyone a much-needed vacation. Which, ironically, leads us to the one truly peaceful part of the game, the respite. The respite is interesting not only because it houses a ghost who is willing to absolutely f*** you up on sight for the cardinal sin of taking 2 cookies when it says only 1, but also because it introduces a concept that is only really teased beforehand up until this point in the game. Side quests. While Solvoid isn't a colossal game by any means, it is one that features a range of side objectives you can accomplish to make the lives of the denizens around you that little bit brighter, and perhaps more importantly for us, to get the game's best ending. By this point in the game, we can have already accomplished more than one of these tasks, which include highlights such as delivering a letter to 2 faraway NPCs, and bringing a flower to a surprisingly emotionally vulnerable looming spectre. However, there's still a fair few left to do even if you've tackled all of them thus far, which is pretty neat in the sense that, at least on my first playthrough, I didn't even really realise I was doing side quests per se to begin with. So this serves as both a pat on the head for your previous actions, and a healthy bit of incentive to investigate more and revisit areas where you think neat stuff might be, which let me give some pet bees to a friendly Molotooth, and find the pit. which is literally just a big hole you can jump into repeatedly while being told how, no, this isn't for any reward, and no, really, you should stop jumping in that pit. And yet is somehow also one of the best and funniest parts of the game. The fun adventures of trying to tackle the available side quests definitely help the game communicate the idea that the next part of its story is the beginning of the end for it. Well, that and the fact things get a decent dose more serious via it giving you 3 mini-games of sorts that you have to complete in order to get to the final section of the game. Navigating an invisible pathway, making our way through a scarecrow maze, and what is essentially Pokemon's boulder puzzles, but with some disembodied heads instead. This area is also where the last 2 side quests rock up, in the form of us reuniting 2 little leech bros together and feeding a hungry rabbit alien thing a cookie from the ghost house, to at least help justify our trauma from there. After using the items gained from these minigames, we begin the final conflict with the Grim, who we learn more about from the NPC of the Emptiness, given the leech reveals she has history with the Grim and knew the spooky grin back when the villain had first entered these strange lands. The leech explains that was back when both she and the Grim had legs, seemingly confirming that these surreal entities did also start out as humans before being transformed by their time here. In fact, the leech explains that when some of the other people who arrived in the Void began to transform beforehand, the Grim said that he was feeding on their misery. And very much looks like he actively actually was, given the powers he seems to have by the time we meet him, and given the leech says the Grim taught her how to consume the negative energy put out by those suffering lost souls. With the threat of the Grim more underlined than ever, we promptly find ourselves face to face with the Face once more, who uses one last gambit to try and trap you in the Void forever, warping this plane of reality into a wacky funhouse mirror of nonsensical design in order to try and make escape seemingly impossible. Only not that impossible, because after a trippy adventure through a corrupted version of the worlds we just adventured through, complete with a brief reunion with the mayor who sent you into this whole situation, who apologises and recognises the error of her ways, we get into the final conflict of the entire game. The Grim returns one final time to try and stop you, half confused by your sudden determination, and reveals he was the first lost soul who arrived in the Void. Whereas our adventure has been motivated by our desire to protect and help others, and bolstered by the help we've received from others in return, the Grim sought to enter and then remain in the Void for revenge, and because he wanted to make others suffer in half-death the way he suffered in life. The Grim believes this made him strong, and he doesn't seem to be completely wrong, in the sense he does have some considerable powers, and he's become able to grab living people and drag them into the Void, with us being the first victim of this particularly unfortunate fate. That said, the Grim, who seems to increasingly become a representation of our own character's mental health struggles here, is ultimately unable to stand against the protagonist's resolve, and is eventually defeated by our complete damn commitment to not giving up, even in the face of what looks like certain doom. While the villain threatens that they'll return the minute the protagonist relapses, which can be read a bunch of different ways, we are returned to the early areas of the game, and woken by the Seeker, who tells you you've been able to drive out the Grim and thus get rid of the Void's corruption, allowing souls to pass on, and returning a less troubling vibe to the place overall, even if it's also said the creature could still return. In a surprisingly heartfelt final sequence, you're able to say a final farewell to all the characters you met before, who talk about how you helped them, and how they've waited around specifically to say thank you and goodbye to you, before then moving on yourself. In your case, though, this takes you not to the afterlife, but rather back to what seems to be your bedroom, showing you have managed to make it back to the land of the living after your strange odyssey. If you've helped everyone out in the side quests and done the optional bonus content, this final moment becomes the best ending and gets an extra hopeful addition to it, including what appears to be a text from one of your loved ones sent before all of this went down, wherein they state everyone cares and is worried about you, and wants to help you out just like they know you'd help them. There's also a pretty nifty locket on your bed that appears to be the same one the leech and the waiting give you as a little parting gift, which seems to prove that A, your experiences were real, and not some sort of awful fever dream, and B, that the bonds you made along the way mattered there too, even if that's just because they may have netted you some flashy bling in the aftermath. I mean, getting a Rolex from Hades has to earn you a bit of bragging rights, right? Now, I know some of these concepts might be so outlandish to the point they don't seem to connect to real life to some people, but I think Solvoid works best because it keeps things vague enough that it can connect with people more universally, with its story being about a main character who clearly goes through the ringer, but is still able to realise those around them deserve to be treated with kindness even if they look like a monster you would usually fight in a video game, and then realise that they too deserve that kind of compassion, even in their darkest moments. Similarly, I think the dialogue and perspective of the characters you meet in The Void, who are usually struggling with a loss of a sense of self and also a deep yearning for things out of their reach, and things they usually can't actively put a name or words to, make them feel pretty intensely relatable at times. If you asked me if I ever felt like a living tooth, my answer would be a resounding, "Are you okay, and do you need medical help?" But reading through some of the lines delivered by these funky little guys, you find sentiments that maybe wouldn't have seemed out of place in a particularly vulnerable journal entry on a particularly bad day. This is all the more interesting for the implication that they are other lost souls, who were unable to find peace with their inner demons, and who suffered cruel and often unusual fates as a result, warped into forms they don't recognise or understand thanks to the impact of the Grim. It's this that really cements the limbo-like element of the world, as your choices are either to overcome immense hardships and retain who you are, or to suffer a brutal fate. That sounds pretty hardcore, sure, but the fact this is shown to be such a challenge makes the ways people are kind to one another in this hellish landscape all the more impactful, and all the more of a testament to just how important it is to look after one another, even when life is looking like a long slide through a broken glass factory. I've been meaning to make this video for I think an actual real calendar year of my life, as I have a big soft spot for this game, and played it at a point in my life where its classic indie game style message about not giving up helped bring me through part of my own long slide through the metaphorical broken glass factory. As such, if you've made it to this point, I'm especially grateful you stuck around listening to me talk about it, and hope you have a good day whenever you hear this, and are haunted by minimal evil smiles, which I think is something we should all hope for one another.